A very good afternoon to you. Welcome to the West Ham Voice on a Saturday afternoon. I don't normally do shows in the afternoons. I don't always get an awful lot of time to do so, but I found myself with a half an hour or so, and I thought I'd get this one out because there seems to be a little bit more movement on one of our transfer targets. Now, I'm going to talk about that. That's, of course, Luis Guilherme, but also that the show's going to focus on a little bit on why we're targeting the Brazilian market for some of our signings. But before all that, if you're new to the channel, please do subscribe to it. It's easy to do so. If you don't have a YouTube account, it's very easy to set one up with your email address. Doesn't cost you anything to do so. Doesn't cost you anything to become a subscriber of this channel. All my content is free. So you can just create a YouTube account. You don't have to put any content on it, but use the YouTube account to become a subscriber of this channel. Also, if you like what you see, what you hear, please do hit the like button that's somewhere down below your screen. And also there's a little bell notification, which will let you know if you click that, it will let you know when the next show is on. Right. Let's talk about Luis Guilherme first. I feel like I've been repeating myself several times over the past week or so, suggesting that the player is due a medical anytime soon. Now, the story is now that it's suggested that the medical could be happening this weekend. For all I know, it's something like 3 o'clock now in the Saturday afternoon. By the time this video goes out, it may be around 4 o'clock. You may have heard that the medical has been done. But my understanding is that he is due a medical sometime this weekend. Apparently, he started to follow some West Ham players on social media. So, hey, obviously this means that he's en route to West Ham United, doesn't it? Look, the last time he played for Palmeiras was on the 2nd of June in a 2-1 win in a Brazilian Serie A game against Criciúma, and which they won 2-1. The player is currently meant to be training with a Brazil under-20 squad, but Palmeiras has said to have given the young Brazilian the green light to have his medical with West Ham. So fingers crossed. Let's see if this one comes off so that we as fans, the pundits, the ITKs, and more importantly, Tim Steidten can start to focus on other transfer targets that we're rumoured to be linked to. Let's see what happens there. But what of Steidten? Look, Tim Steidten has been with us just under a year now. In that time, he's helped to bring in 3 players that I think have helped to transform West Ham in one way or another. The first season, we saw Mohamed Kudus, Dinos Mavropanos, and Edson Alvarez come to West Ham. And I think they've made a good contribution. Alvarez, for example, has proven to be a most important signing for the club. In his first half of the season, he made us forget that Declan Rice had indeed left for North London. And he demonstrated exactly what we were missing in the heart of our midfield. We've been missing it for some time, a proper defensive-minded midfielder with the qualities to forge the defense and the midfield and attack all together. Look, okay, the second half of the season probably wasn't as good as the first half. When he started to pick up yellow cards and suspensions, it kind of impacted on what he was delivering. But I think Alvarez overall has been a success at West Ham. After not being that successful at Arsenal but doing exceptionally well at Stuttgart, Dinos Mavropanos returned to the Premier League, and it took a little bit of time for him to settle back in here. I think maybe surprisingly for some fans. Now, many would suggest that perhaps he would have settled in better if he had a more agile defensive partner alongside him. All right, we know that Mavropanos has got a personal error or two in his game, but I think again, the season that's just passed has been important for him, and hopefully the second and the next season he'd be much more stable. Let's see what happens with transfers, because apparently we are looking at 2 central defenders. So let's see if Mavropanos is going to be either a main feature in the starting 11 or going to be a backup. And then, of course, the arrival of Mohamed Kudus was an absolute delight. And we can all see that another season at West Ham United is likely to elevate him to be the next, near £100 million player that we all know he's capable of becoming. He's been absolutely superb for West Ham. Now, we know that most of these players were identified by others, by Mark Noble, etc., but it was Steidten who is credited for schmoozing the players, talking to them, persuading them that West Ham United was indeed the club to sign for. So during that summer transfer window, many of us started to think that perhaps the David Moyes-Tim Steidten partnership was going great guns. After all, David Moyes got what he wanted. He got several players in that he wanted, like the likes of James Ward-Prowse, and Steidten had an influence on getting some up-and-coming talent through as well. But then the January transfer window came, and and Steidten must have been asking himself a few questions as to why he bothered to come to West Ham at all. There was zero action in that transfer window, except for the failed loan signing of Calvin Phillips, which was definitely a Moyes requirement, and the departure of maybe more players than we really could have afforded to let go of. The inevitable happened, didn't it? And we had a terrible second half of the season. But one of the transfer stories that we didn't get was the much publicized transfer of Ghanaian-born Ibrahim Osman from Northland, who was eventually signed by Brighton and who will join them this coming summer. So when it was finally announced that David Moyes was definitely leaving West Ham United, I guess, for Tim Steidten, that must have been a bit of a relief, a bit of a breath of fresh air, because it means that this project that we keep hearing about could finally take off for good without any interference or distractions. The chasing of Osman that Moyes did not agree to was a bit of a sign of things to come. Steidten not only wants to ensure that we have the right players for the here and now, his job is to also spend the transfer money wisely, but do it in a way where the signings that we get can maybe be something for the future, a future investment as well. And this is why I believe Steidten has been focusing heavily on the Brazilian transfer market. Now, for any Brazilian teenager breaking into a first team like as big as something like Corinthians, Sao Paulo, Flamengo, Fluminense, etc., there's a good chance that they've just earned themselves a lucrative transfer to European football in the near future. The 5 most expensive transfers in Brazil in the 23-24 season were all players sold to one of Europe's major clubs. Their average fee was around £20 million, and their average age was around 19. Brazil has always been fertile ground for growing talent, but its export industry is busier than ever when it comes to the best young players, particularly those who are en route to the Premier League. Over the past few years, the number of Brazilians playing in the English top flight has risen from 12 in 2018 to 33 last season. Some of those arrived directly from Brazil, some from other European clubs, but almost all have something in common: leaving Brazil as a young player with a bag full of potential rather than being the finished product. Now, European agents have embedded themselves in South America, in Brazil, to facilitate this boom. And if you recall my saying in a few videos ago, perhaps we haven't given Rob Newman the credit that maybe he deserved in setting up networks with 4 Brazilian clubs in particular back in 2022. He set up networks with Flamengo, Vasco da Gama, Botafogo, and Fluminense. Now, 5 players who featured in the game against England, in the friendly against England in March earlier this year, are signed up to one particular agency, and that's Rock Nation. And in particular, and it probably won't come as any surprise, that they represent some of the biggest talents, Brazilian talents in football at the moment. Vinicius Jr. At Real Madrid, Gabriel Martinelli of Arsenal, our very own Lucas Paquetá, and centre-back Murillo, who signed for Nottingham Forest for around about £10 million last summer. He signed from Corinthians, and it's suggested now that he's probably worth double, maybe even treble the price that Nottingham Forest paid for him. And Rock are behind all of these signings, and they're also behind the latest sensation, another player from Palmeiras, Endrick, who's still only 17 years of age, is going to move to Real Madrid for a fee of around £45 million when he turns 18 on the 21st of July this year. Now, although European clubs have always dipped into the South American markets for players, one of the big differences, as I've said over the past few years, has been the ages of these players, where clubs are investing more heavily on the future rather than the here and now. So it's become quite a trend for players of around about 18 to 21 to be signed up by European clubs. Several Premier League clubs are ahead of West Ham on this, with Murillo, as I've just mentioned, for Nottingham Forest, and Chelsea having spent a considerable amount of money last summer. They spent around about just under £30 million on buying striker David Washington and winger Angelo Gabriel, two more Brazilian players from Club Santos in last summer's transfer window, and they joined midfielder Andre Santos at the club, who joined for around £10 million in January of 2023. Now, Santos, who they bought from Vasco da Gama, has already been loaned out to Nottingham Forest and then French club Strasbourg last season. So they're all getting in on the act, and so too are clubs like Crystal Palace. Crystal Palace last summer went out and bought Mateus Franca for around about £18 million as well. So this is a transfer policy that many clubs around Europe have been forging ahead with, but it would never have worked under Moyes, who always loved to have Premier League proven players who are often older, who are often more expensive. And here's why now we find ourselves in a position where we're having to rebuild the squad again because we've got many of the aging players who don't have an awful lot of sell-on value. It's difficult for us to move them on in order to bring in fresh young players. But how are these players from overseas, how are these young players from overseas managing to come to Britain now that we've moved out of the EU? After Brexit, English clubs had initially found themselves shackled by new governing body endorsement rules, where foreign signings had to pass through. The criteria was strict and threatened to strangle clubs' ability to buy younger, untapped potential from abroad. But a new rule loosened those rules and freed up the market, especially for clubs who were not able to pay a king's ransom for players. After all, not everybody's a Real Madrid. The FA granted the clubs the right to sign at least 2 wildcard players from anywhere around the world. That means players who may not previously have met work permit requirements can now move to an English club. So it's not unlikely that West Ham will sign any more than 2 players under the age of 21 this summer. Hence, probably why we've only been linked so far to Guilherme and Gasova. They're the only 2 Brazilian players that are actually under 21. All the other Brazilian players that we've been linked to are either already playing in Europe or are over the age of 21. But these under 21 players are really where the lucrative money could be made in the future. Succeed, and before you know it, they could be worth double, treble what West Ham would have paid for them. Now, that makes sense why Steidten really wanted Osman last January. All right, he's not Brazilian, but it's a similar sort of approach. A young African player that's not quite the finished article, but someone who, if did well, could end up being worth quite a lot more. We've seen this, we've seen Brighton do this sort of thing over and over again, where they bring in players from around the world at very low fees and end up sending them for quite a large amount of money. Now, I know what people are going to say, well, we'll just continue to be a selling club. But the difference being is that if we actually get these players in at a low price, sell them at a high price, and reinvest that money in the squad, then that gives you a balance where, even though we might sell a player that we've only had for maybe a couple of seasons, the money goes back into the squad and rebuilds it again and again. So this is why I think Steidten is so keen on landing Guilherme this summer. These players may not necessarily be 100% ready for first team football, but with the right guidance, within a season or 2, and still at the age of, like Guilherme, 18, even if we keep him for 3 years, he'd still only be 21 years of age. And that could bring a huge profit to West Ham, which, as I said, could go back investing straight back into the squad for the next batch of tomorrow's stars, not only from Brazil, but from Africa and other nations as well. Now, Not all these players are going to work out. We know this. But this is where Steidten ensures that the data or analysis he's given will help him make those right decisions. This is clearly Steidten's project, but he's not losing focus on what we also need for the here and now. Hence the link to Fabrizio Bruno, recently 28 years of age, who many would argue would have been a solid, if not necessarily an exciting defensive prospect. But that's probably also why Steidten is now rumoured to have turned his attention to 24-year-old Vitao, another Brazilian central defender. After a prompt from a viewer in one of my last videos, I did a bit more research on Vitao just to understand what the current setup is. It was suggested to me that Vitao did indeed sign a contract to become a permanent signing with International, who he had been on loan to for the past couple of seasons from Ukrainian club Shakhtar Donetsk. Now, International paid Shakhtar a fee of €1.5 million for the permanent signing of the player. They did that back in January, and he will become a permanent International player in July. Vitao was a youth product of Palmeiras, and back in 2019, at the age of 19, he was sold to Shakhtar Donetsk for €4 million on a 5-year deal. When the war broke out in Ukraine, Vitao took advantage of going back on loan to a club outside of the Ukraine, and he headed back to Brazil. So the nominal fee of €1.5 million that the Ukrainian club received from International has given them a little bit back of the €4 million that they paid for him in the first place. But what Donetsk have done is they've also retained a 20% of the player's economic value, with the other 80% obviously being owned by International. So if we do buy the player, or if anyone buys the player, International wants something like €10 million for it, because 2 million of that will go straight back to Donetsk on top of the 1.5 million that they've already received from him. The Brazilian club they do see Vitao as a central focal point in their defense. He's becoming an important player for them. So in order for them to let him go, they need to spend money to replace him. So at 24, Vitao actually sounds like a bit of a bargain. In fact, a better one than 28-year-old Bruno, where Vitao has got experience of European League. He's got experience of playing Champions League and Europa League football. At 24 years of age, he's still got time to develop, but he could be ready-made to step into the West Ham team from maybe day one. Tim Steidten is certainly working hard for his money, and he's certainly been patient, as there would have been no point in him manoeuvring such transfers under David Moyes. Despite no firm signings yet, the direction of travel in transfers is becoming clearer and more exciting as each day goes by. Now, like I said, if you're new to the channel, please do hit that subscribe button and the like button, and I'll be back again very soon with another transfer story. Many thanks and have a great weekend.